Jamal had always been used to life on the streets. For years, the harsh realities of living homeless in the busy streets of Chicago had become his world. At just 14 years old, he had learned to survive in ways most people couldn't imagine. His skin, a deep shade of brown, blended in with the city's busy crowds, but he wasn't just another face among them. He had a story, one filled with struggle, yet filled with hope. Every day was a battle. Jamal woke up early in the morning, trying to find a safe place to sleep the night before. He didn't have a home to return to. Instead, he slept in dark corners or abandoned buildings, always listening for footsteps, always watching out for anyone who might want to harm him. But no matter how cold or hard the ground felt, Jamal knew that sleep would be hard to come by. The streets weren't forgiving, and neither were the people passing by. Still, he never lost his will to survive. He had learned to be resourceful. The city was full of discarded things, things that people no longer needed. Jamal would search through trash cans and piles of things people had thrown away. Food was always a challenge. Sometimes, he was lucky enough to find a leftover sandwich or a drink, but there were days when hunger gnawed at him. On those days, he'd walk through the city, looking for kind strangers who might offer a piece of bread or a few coins. Jamal didn't mind the hunger. He knew what it was like to live without, and somehow he had learned to keep going. But what hurt more than the empty stomachs or the long nights was the feeling of being invisible. He wasn't seen by most people. They saw a homeless boy and turned their eyes away. He wasn't anyone's concern. The world moved around him, but no one stopped to look twice. One chilly afternoon, after spending hours wandering the streets, Jamal was near the park, his stomach growling with hunger. He'd been searching for something to eat, but it seemed like there was nothing today. His shoes were worn out, and his jacket, though old and faded, kept him warm enough against the cold wind. He was just about to give up when something caught his eye. There, glimmering in the grass near a park bench, was something that didn't belong. Jamal's heart skipped a beat, a small diamond ring, sparkling like it had just fallen from the sky. At first, he thought it was just a shiny stone, something someone might have dropped and forgotten. But as he crouched down and picked it up, he could feel the weight of it. This was no ordinary ring. He turned the ring over in his hands. The diamond was clear, reflecting the sunlight in every direction. It was beautiful, far more beautiful than anything Jamal had ever seen. He felt a twinge of excitement, but also hesitation. He wasn't sure what to do with it. His mind raced. This could change his life, he thought. If he sold the ring, he could finally get something to eat, maybe even buy a new pair of shoes. But then, something inside him stopped. He remembered the lessons his mother had taught him before she passed away. She'd always told him to do what was right, even when it was hard. Jamal wasn't sure what the right thing was, but he felt that keeping the ring wasn't the answer. He stood up, slipping the ring into his pocket. "I have to find out who lost this," he whispered to himself, already feeling the weight of the decision he had made. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jamal knew this was the right thing to do. Little did he know, returning this ring would change his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jamal stood in the middle of the park, his hands clutching the shiny diamond ring. It felt heavy in his pocket, like it was carrying a secret. As he walked along the busy street, his thoughts raced. The ring could change everything. For the first time in months, he could imagine a life without hunger, a life where he didn't have to sleep on cold streets. He could sell it and buy new shoes, or maybe even get a warm meal in a real restaurant. But something deep inside told him it wasn't that simple. The excitement in his chest was quickly replaced by a knot in his stomach. He had never owned anything of value. And now, here it was, a ring that was probably worth more than everything he had. His mind couldn't stop thinking about how much good it could do for him. He'd never felt temptation like this before. As Jamal walked, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. He stopped near a street corner and sat on a low wall, staring at the ring in his hand. His heart told him one thing: keep it, sell it, It's the only chance you've got. But his mother's voice echoed in his head, the same voice that had always guided him when he was a child. She had taught him to always do what was right, to never let greed control him. Jamal had lost his mother when he was very young. She had passed away from an illness, and since then, he had been on his own. But he still remembered the lessons she had given him. Always choose honesty, she had told him. Even when no one else is watching, always do the right thing. The thought of his mother made Jamal feel guilty. She would be disappointed if he kept the ring. It wasn't his, and no matter how badly he needed money, he couldn't take something that didn't belong to him. His heart was torn. He was hungry, tired, and alone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that returning the ring was the right thing to do. Jamal stood up and stuffed the ring back into his pocket. He wasn't sure where to begin searching for its owner, but he knew he couldn't just walk away from it. He had found it for a reason. He couldn't keep it. The thought of finding someone who might need it, someone who had lost it, and was probably worried sick, pushed him forward. He couldn't be the one to make someone else suffer. He walked through the streets, asking people if they had lost anything, but no one seemed to have lost a ring. Jamal felt frustrated. People were busy, rushing by him without even stopping to look at him. The city seemed so cold sometimes, as though everyone was too wrapped up in their own lives to notice anyone else. As he walked, Jamal thought about his options. Maybe he could ask around in the park, or visit some of the nearby stores, and post a note about the ring. But it wasn't going to be easy. His stomach growled, reminding him how hungry he was. He wondered how long it would take to find the owner. It could be days before someone came forward. Would he be able to keep going without food? Was his decision worth it? But deep down, Jamal knew the answer. No matter how hard life had become, he had to do the right thing. He had to return the ring. This was more than just a decision about a valuable object. It was about his character, about proving to himself that he could make the right choice even when it wasn't easy. Jamal took a deep breath and began his search. Little did he know, his choice would set him on a path that would change his life forever. Jamal knew finding the owner of the diamond ring wouldn't be easy. As he walked through the streets, he felt the weight of the decision he had made. His stomach growled again, reminding him how hungry he was, but he pushed the thought aside. He couldn't focus on food right now. The ring was far more important. He walked back to the park where he had found it. People were enjoying the sunny afternoon, sitting on benches, walking dogs, or playing frisbee. Jamal felt out of place. He was just a homeless boy in worn-out clothes, but he couldn't let that stop him. He had to do the right thing. He started by asking a few people nearby. "Excuse me, has anyone lost a ring?" he asked, holding the shiny diamond ring in his hand. But no one seemed to be paying attention to him. They were too busy with their own lives to notice a young boy asking about a lost ring. Jamal's shoulders sagged, and he began to feel discouraged. It seemed like no one cared about the ring or the person who had lost it. But he refused to give up. If he couldn't find the owner here, he'd have to try somewhere else. As he walked around the park, his eyes fell on a small cafe across the street. It was a cozy place, with a warm light spilling out from the windows. People sat at tables, sipping coffee, chatting, and laughing. The cafe seemed like a place where someone who had lost something valuable might go to ask for help. Jamal's legs were tired, but he made his way across the street and into the cafe. The bell above the door rang as he entered, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Behind the counter stood an older woman with kind eyes and gray hair tied into a neat bun. She was wiping down a counter, but when she saw Jamal, she paused for a moment. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice soft and warm. Jamal hesitated, then spoke up. "I found this," he said, pulling the diamond ring out of his pocket. "I think someone lost it. I'm trying to find the owner." The woman's eyes widened in surprise when she saw the ring. She walked over to Jamal, her face serious. "That's a beautiful ring," she said. "I'm sure someone is missing it." Jamal nodded. I've been asking around, but no one seems to know who lost it." The woman smiled gently, her eyes softening. "Well, why don't you let me help?" she said. "I have a small social media page for the cafe. I'll post a picture of the ring and ask if anyone's lost one. We might get lucky." Jamal's heart lifted. He hadn't thought about asking for help this way. It felt like a small chance, but it was better than doing nothing. The woman took the ring from him and carefully placed it on the counter. She took a quick photo with her phone and typed up a short message. After posting it online, she turned back to Jamal with a smile. "There, it's done. We'll see if anyone responds." Jamal felt grateful but still unsure. What if no one saw the post? What if the owner never found out? But he had done everything he could. He thanked the woman and stepped out of the cafe, his heart still uncertain. As Jamal left the cafe, he felt a small flicker of hope. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was doing the right thing, and that gave him the strength to keep moving forward. He knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people willing to help, and just maybe, someone out there would be looking for that ring too. Jamal spent the next few days anxiously waiting for news about the diamond ring. Every time he passed by the cafe, he couldn't help but look inside, hoping to see Mrs. Alvarez with a smile on her face, telling him that someone had come to claim it. But each time, he left disappointed, walking past the tables and chairs with no good news. His hunger grew worse with each passing day, and his shoes, now worn down to almost nothing, made his feet ache. But he kept going, telling himself that his search for the ring was more important than food or comfort. The weight of the diamond ring still felt heavy in his pocket, even though he hadn't sold it or kept it. He knew that someone, somewhere, was missing it, and he wanted to be the one to return it. Then, one afternoon, as Jamal was walking past the cafe again, he noticed Mrs. Alvarez standing outside, waving at him. Her warm smile was the first thing that made him feel like there was hope in the world. "Jamal, I've got some news," she called out, motioning for him to come closer. Jamal hurried over, his heart beating faster. Maybe someone had come to claim the ring after all. "Someone saw my post," Mrs. Alvarez said, her eyes bright with excitement. "A woman named Mrs. Lauren Whitmore called in. She's the one who lost the ring. She said she's been looking everywhere for it." Jamal felt a rush of relief. He had done it. He had found the owner. His efforts were paying off. Mrs. Alvarez smiled at him warmly. "She wants to meet you," Mrs. Alvarez continued. "She's coming by later this afternoon. You've done a good thing, Jamal." Jamal could hardly believe it. He had never imagined that a simple act of returning a lost ring could lead to something like this. He felt a little nervous, unsure of what to expect. What kind of person was Mrs. Whitmore? Would she thank him, or would she be shocked to see him, a homeless boy, holding something so valuable? A few hours later, as the sun began to set, a sleek black car pulled up outside the cafe. The door opened, and out stepped a well-dressed woman with short, dark hair and sharp, elegant features. Jamal's stomach fluttered nervously as he watched her approach. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the cafe for a moment, then spotted Jamal standing by the door. She walked over, her eyes scanning him for a moment before she spoke. "You must be Jamal," she said, her voice smooth and polite. "Thank you for finding my ring." Jamal held the ring out to her, unsure of what to say. His hands trembled slightly as he gave it back to her. "I'm glad you found me," he said quietly. "I didn't know who it belonged to, but I couldn't keep it." Mrs. Whitmore took the ring with a look of surprise, then gently turned it over in her hand, admiring the diamond. "I've been looking for this everywhere," she said softly. "It's very special to me." Jamal nodded, unsure of what to say next. He had done the right thing, but now that the ring was back in its owner's hands, he felt a little lost. He wasn't sure how people like Mrs. Whitmore would react to someone like him. Mrs. Whitmore studied him for a moment, as though reading something in his eyes. She paused and then spoke again. "You have a lot of courage, returning something that valuable. Most people wouldn't have done it." Jamal felt his heart beat faster. He had expected a simple thank you, but this felt different. Her words meant more than just politeness. There was something sincere in her voice. "I just wanted to do the right thing," Jamal said softly, looking down at the ground. Mrs. Whitmore smiled at him. And for a moment, Jamal saw something more than just a wealthy woman standing in front of him. He saw someone who was genuinely grateful, someone who saw him not as a homeless boy, but as a person with integrity. "Thank you," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice filled with emotion. "I won't forget what you've done." Jamal nodded, feeling a warm sense of pride. The ring was no longer his, but in that moment, he realized he had something more valuable than money. He had made a real difference in someone's life. Jamal had never expected much in return for doing the right thing. After all, he was used to going unnoticed. The streets had taught him that people often didn't care about someone like him. But as he stood in front of Mrs. Whitmore, watching her hold the diamond ring, something in her eyes told him that this was different. Her voice was sincere, and her words were not just polite. They were full of appreciation. "Thank you, Jamal," she said again, her voice gentle. "You've done something very rare." Not many people would have returned something like this. Jamal didn't know how to respond. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling awkward under her gaze. All he had done was return a ring. It didn't seem like such a big deal to him. He didn't expect anyone to thank him for it. But the way she spoke made him feel like he had done something important. Mrs. Whitmore smiled warmly at him. "I want to help you," she said. Jamal blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Help him? Why would someone like her want to help someone like him? "You've shown so much honesty," she continued, "and that's not something I take lightly. It's rare these days." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had heard people talk about helping others before, but he never thought anyone would want to help him. He had spent so long trying to survive on his own that the idea of someone offering help was almost foreign to him. "I don't need anything," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I just wanted to give it back." Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened. "I know you don't, but sometimes doing the right thing deserves something more. You've been through so much, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes studying him carefully. Jamal hesitated, not sure if he wanted to talk about his struggles, but something about Mrs. Whitmore made him feel like he could trust her. He looked down at the ground, feeling a little embarrassed. "It's not easy," he admitted quietly. "I don't have a home, or much of anything." Mrs. Whitmore nodded as if she understood. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small card. "This is my contact information," she said, handing it to him. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call me." Jamal looked at the card, unsure what to say. She was offering him help, but it felt strange. He had never accepted help from anyone before. The streets had taught him to rely on himself, to never expect anything from others. But the kindness in her voice made him wonder if it was time to accept something different. Mrs. Whitmore didn't seem to notice his hesitation. She smiled again, this time with more warmth. "Take your time, Jamal. I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. You have someone who cares." Jamal stood there for a moment, looking down at the card in his hand. The weight of it seemed to represent more than just a phone number. It felt like an invitation to a new kind of life, one where people cared, one where kindness existed. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "You've done something special today, Jamal. Remember that. And remember, you deserve better than this life. You deserve a chance." Jamal pocketed the card, still unsure of what to do next, but for the first time, he didn't feel completely lost. He had always believed that kindness was something rare, something that didn't come around often. But Mrs. Whitmore had shown him that it wasn't impossible, and that maybe, just maybe, things could change for him. As she got into her car and drove away, Jamal watched her go, still holding the card in his hand. He felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and a little bit of fear. Could he really reach out to someone like her? Would she still be there if he needed help? His mind was full of questions, but one thing was clear. For the first time in a long time, Jamal didn't feel like he was just another homeless kid lost in the city. He turned back toward the street, his steps a little lighter than before. There was a possibility now, a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for years. And though he didn't know what the future held, he felt like he had just taken the first step towards something better. Jamal couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Whitmore's offer. He had spent days walking the streets, wondering what he was going to do with his life, when a simple act of kindness had suddenly opened a door he hadn't expected. At first, he had thought it was all too good to be true. People like him didn't get chances like this, did they? Still, the card sat in his pocket, a reminder that maybe there was more to life than just surviving day by day. Mrs. Whitmore's words kept echoing in his mind. You deserve a chance. The thought of actually having a chance at a different life made Jamal feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Days went by, and Jamal wrestled with himself. He had never asked for help before. In fact, he had always been taught to rely on no one but himself. But something about Mrs. Whitmore's kindness made him believe that maybe it was okay to trust someone else. Maybe he wasn't destined to be lost forever. One evening, after a long day of wandering, Jamal found himself sitting in the same small cafe where he had met Mrs. Whitmore. The warmth of the place and the smell of fresh coffee reminded him of what he had been missing: comfort. He sat down at the counter, resting his elbows on the smooth surface, his fingers tracing the edges of the card in his pocket. He could feel the weight of the decision. Should he call her? What would happen if he did? His heart beat faster as he thought about it. What if she didn't really want to help him? What if he was making a mistake? The sound of the cafe door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Jamal looked up to see Mrs. Alvarez walking in, smiling warmly at him. She had become a kind of friend over the past few days. She always greeted him with kindness and listened to his worries when he had them. Jamal, how's it going? She asked as she approached. Have you heard anything from the woman about the ring? Jamal gave her a small smile. Yeah, she came by. Her name's Mrs. Whitmore. She was really nice. She gave me her card and said if I ever needed help, I could call her. Mrs. Alvarez raised an eyebrow, looking surprised. That's generous of her. Have you thought about calling her? Jamal hesitated. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a good idea. People like me don't get help, you know. Mrs. Alvarez smiled kindly, her eyes softening. Jamal, you're not just people like you. You've got something special. I've seen it. It's rare, what you did. Not everyone would have returned that ring. Jamal looked down at his hands. It just felt like the right thing to do, he said quietly. But I don't know if I deserve help. I've been on my own for so long. People don't care about kids like me. Mrs. Alvarez placed a hand on his shoulder. There are good people out there, Jamal. And Mrs. Whitmore, she's one of them. You deserve a chance. Don't let fear stop you from seeing what's out there. Her words sank in, and Jamal found himself staring at the card in his hand. It seemed simple enough, but in his mind, it felt like a lifeline. A lifeline he could either grab or let slip away. He took a deep breath and made up his mind. I think I'm going to call her, he said, his voice steady. Mrs. Alvarez smiled brightly. That's the spirit. Go for it, Jamal. You never know what could happen. With a newfound sense of determination, Jamal stood up and walked outside. He found a quiet corner in the park and pulled out the card, staring at the numbers for a moment before dialing. His heart raced as the phone rang, each second feeling like a lifetime. When the phone clicked and a voice answered, Jamal felt a wave of relief. Hello. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was warm and kind, just as he remembered. Hi. Mrs. Whitmore, Jamal said, his voice shaky but growing steadier. It's Jamal. "The boy who found your ring. I remember you, Jamal," she said. "How are you?" Jamal took a deep breath. "I'm doing okay. I've been thinking about what you said, about having a chance." There was a pause on the other end, and then Mrs. Whitmore spoke again, her voice full of understanding. "I'm glad you called," she said. "Let's talk about how we can help you." Jamal felt a small but powerful shift inside him. For the first time in his life, it felt like the world was opening up, not just to him, but for him. Jamal sat nervously in the sleek black car, staring out the window as it drove through the city. The tall buildings, the busy streets, the noise, it all felt so different from the world he had known. He had spent most of his life on the streets, where everything was a struggle. Now he was being driven to Mrs. Whitmore's home, a place where everything seemed so normal, comfortable. He could hardly believe it was real. When he had called her, Jamal wasn't sure what to expect. But Mrs. Whitmore had been kind, telling him she would help him transition from the streets into a more stable life. She had arranged for him to stay in a small guest apartment near her home while he figured things out. Jamal had agreed to the idea, even though everything about it felt foreign to him. The car finally pulled up to a large house, a house that looked like something from a magazine. It was beautiful, with large windows and a manicured garden. Jamal stared at the house in awe. He had never seen anything like it. Mrs. Whitmore met him at the door, her warm smile reassuring him. "Welcome, Jamal," she said as she opened the door. "I know this is a big change, but we'll take it one step at a time." Jamal stepped inside, his shoes barely making a sound on the polished floors. The house smelled fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the cold, musty places he was used to. Mrs. Whitmore led him to the guest apartment, a small but cozy space with soft lighting and a comfortable bed. Jamal couldn't believe it. There were fresh towels, a clean bed, and even a small desk by the window. "This is your space," Mrs. Whitmore said, giving him a moment to take it all in. "You can stay here for as long as you need." Jamal nodded, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. He had never imagined anything like this. For so long, he had struggled just to find a place to sleep, and now he had a room of his own. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "You've done the hard part already. Now it's time for you to take care of yourself." Over the next few days, Jamal tried to adjust to his new life. Mrs. Whitmore helped him get the essentials: clothes, hygiene products, and even a phone. It all felt so different from the way he had lived before. The food was plentiful, and he could eat whenever he wanted without worrying about where his next meal would come from. He didn't have to hide or scavenge or sleep on the cold streets. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. But adjusting wasn't easy. Jamal felt out of place in this new world. When he went to the small store to buy food, he was nervous, unsure of what to do or say. He hadn't interacted with people who lived in the world of comfort and normalcy for years. The people in the store looked at him with curiosity, and he felt their eyes on him. They'd probably wondered what a homeless kid like him was doing in a nice store like this. He was used to being ignored or treated with indifference, and the attention made him uncomfortable. One evening, as Jamal was sitting on the couch in the guest apartment, trying to study the books Mrs. Whitmore had given him, he felt frustrated. The words on the page seemed to blur together, and he couldn't focus. It felt like he was trying to catch up on a lifetime of missed lessons. Mrs. Whitmore knocked on the door and stepped in, smiling kindly. "How are you doing?" Jamal looked up, his face filled with uncertainty. "It's hard," he admitted. "I don't understand some of this. I'm so far behind." She walked over and sat next to him. "It's okay," she said softly. "It will take time, but you can do it. You've already shown that you have what it takes to succeed. You just have to keep going." Her words gave him comfort, and Jamal felt a little lighter. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect right away. Maybe he just needed to take it one step at a time. As the days passed, Jamal began to feel more at home in this new life. It wasn't easy, but he was starting to believe in himself. He wasn't just a homeless boy anymore. He was someone who had been given a chance to build a better future. And with each small victory, Jamal knew he was getting closer to making that future a reality. Months passed, and Jamal's life slowly began to take shape. His days had a rhythm now, something he had never known before. He woke up in a comfortable bed, ate regular meals, and even started going to a small school nearby. It wasn't easy at first. He still struggled with some of the lessons, and he had to work hard to catch up with his classmates. But every day was a step forward. Mrs. Whitmore continued to guide him, always reminding him that it was okay to take things one day at a time. She encouraged him to reach out when he needed help, but more than that, she taught him to believe in himself. Jamal had spent so much of his life thinking he was just another lost kid, but now he was starting to see that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the small cafe where he had first met Mrs. Whitmore, he thought about how far he had come. He had a place to call home, a future that seemed brighter than he had ever hoped. And most importantly, he had learned the value of kindness and hard work. But something inside him told him he could do more. He could give back, just like Mrs. Whitmore had given him a chance. "I'm going to help others," Jamal said quietly to himself, sitting back in the chair. Over the next few weeks, Jamal started volunteering at a local shelter for homeless children. He wanted to make a difference in the lives of others who had experienced the same struggles he had. He knew firsthand how hard it was to be invisible, to feel like no one cared. And now he wanted to be the person who reached out to others, just as someone had reached out to him. The first time he visited the shelter, he was nervous. He didn't know what to expect. But as he walked through the doors, he saw kids just like him. Kids who were hungry, scared, and alone. Jamal felt a deep connection with them. He remembered what it felt like to be in their shoes, and he knew he had something to offer. He could help them find hope, just as he had found hope. Jamal began spending his afternoons at the shelter, talking to the kids, playing games, and helping them with their homework. He shared his story with them, telling them how he had been lost, but had found a way to build a better life. He wanted them to know that their circumstances didn't define who they were, and that they could overcome any challenge if they believed in themselves. It wasn't always easy. Some of the kids were skeptical at first, just as Jamal had been when Mrs. Whitmore had offered him help. But as the days passed, Jamal saw the change in their eyes. They began to trust him. They started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have a better life too. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, Jamal sat on a bench outside, looking up at the stars. He felt proud of what he was doing. For the first time, he felt like he was making a real difference in the world. His past had been difficult, but it had shaped him into someone strong and resilient. And now he was using that strength to help others. As he thought about his journey, he couldn't help but think of Mrs. Whitmore. She had been the one to give him a chance, to show him that there was more to life than just survival. Now it was his turn to pay it forward. He had found a new purpose, to give back and help those who needed it most. Jamal smiled to himself, knowing that his story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he would face them with the same determination that had brought him this far. Jamal sat on the stage, the spotlight shining down on him, and the crowd in front of him seemed much larger than he had imagined. His heart raced as he looked out at the faces in the audience. Some were strangers, some were familiar, but they were all here for one reason: to hear his story. It had been a year since Jamal had walked into Mrs. Whitmore's life, a year since he had found the diamond ring and made the decision that would change everything. Now, standing in front of this crowd, he could hardly believe how far he had come. From the streets of Chicago to speaking at an event to raise awareness for homeless youth, it felt like a dream. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of the shelter where he had spent so many afternoons volunteering, helping other kids like himself. He had shared his story with the world, but today it was different. Today, he was talking to the very people who could help make a difference, people who had the power to change the lives of children who were still struggling, just like he once had. As he looked at the audience, Jamal felt a wave of gratitude. He thought about the long nights on the streets, the days spent searching for food, and the feeling of being invisible. But now, none of that mattered. He had a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. And it all started with one simple decision: to return a diamond ring. "Thank you," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here, and thank you for caring. I know what it's like to feel like no one sees you, to feel like you're just another kid lost in the world. But I'm here to tell you that there's hope." He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The words felt different coming from him now. They were real, not just something he had heard from someone else. He had lived this journey, and now he was sharing it with others. "I used to think that I wasn't worth helping. I thought that no one would care, that I was just another homeless kid on the streets. But then something changed. A woman named Mrs. Whitmore gave me a chance. She didn't see me as just a homeless boy. She saw me for who I could be, not for what I had been." Jamal's voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. He wanted the audience to understand. "I found that ring, and I didn't keep it. I returned it because that's what my mother taught me to do. She taught me that no matter how hard life gets, you have to choose the right path. And even though I didn't have much, I knew I had to do the right thing." He looked at the audience, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "And that decision changed my life. It led me to Mrs. Whitmore, to a place where I could finally have a chance at a better future. But it didn't stop there. It made me realize that I have a responsibility to help others. There are so many kids out there who need help, just like I did. And I'm here to tell you that we can make a difference." Jamal paused again, this time to gather his thoughts. "I'm standing here today because people like Mrs. Whitmore believed in me. She didn't just give me a roof over my head. She gave me the chance to believe in myself. And now, I'm doing the same for other kids. I'm working with a shelter that gives kids a place to stay, a place to feel safe, and most importantly, a place to believe in themselves." As he spoke, Jamal felt his confidence growing. He wasn't just sharing a story anymore. He was inspiring change. He was showing everyone in the room that it was possible to overcome the hardest obstacles, no matter how hopeless things seemed. "And I want to thank you all," Jamal said, his voice strong now. "Because you're the ones who can help make this change happen. You're the ones who can make a difference in the lives of kids who need it the most. So please, don't forget what you've heard today. Don't forget that kindness, no matter how small, can change someone's life forever." The room erupted into applause, and Jamal stood there, a sense of pride filling his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. He had made it. He had gone from a homeless boy with nothing to someone who had the power to make a real difference. And it all started with the decision to do the right thing. As the applause died down, Jamal smiled to himself. He knew his journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he could see where it was going. And whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready for them.